So, hello and welcome to another video from Quaker Council for European Affairs in this series of videos about the COVID-19 situation. I'm here today with Molly Scott Cato, former Green MEP for the southwest of England and professor in economics, and George Thurley, who's co-clerk or co-chair of the Europe and Middle East Young Friends. And so over the next few minutes, we'll try and analyse the current situation. Where are we in terms of economic justice and climate justice? How's this impacted by COVID-19? And what are the things that we need to be thinking about in the coming weeks and months? So I've heard a lot of different perspectives in the last few weeks about how significant a moment we are in. All the way from people saying this will pass in a few weeks to this is our last chance to address climate change. Molly, where are you on this? How do you see this moment?
I have a little phrase that is in my head which I find quite useful, and that's that this is a war without a war. Because always as a green economist, I've been really concerned that we need to find a moment of radicalisation to bring about the really fundamental transformation that we need to see in our society to achieve social justice, but also to achieve sustainability and ensure we have, enough serious policies to deal with the climate emergency. And my anxiety has always been that only a war has actually created that kind of radicalisation. If you look back to 1945 or even to sort of 1651 and the Civil War. But it seems to me this is a hugely radicalising experience. It's an experience that everybody's involved in, not just in Britain or Belgium, but right across the world, and or the Netherlands, where George is. And so, yeah, I think everybody will be changed by this. And I think not only, we can talk about specific ways in which they're changed, but also just the fact that they're cracked out of their everyday lives and everything they've taken for granted is disappeared. And that really is a situation in which you can make really important changes. That's not to say necessarily the changes will go in the direction we'd all like to see, but I do think there's a massive amount of radical potential in this moment.
And George, obviously, this is a very sad time on a human level, but you're a bit of a historian as well. I mean, how do you see the moment we're in?
Yeah, I guess similar to Molly, it's there are opportunities here as well as obviously the negative things that are going on. There is a cynical part of me that worries that we might be understating or forgetting the ability of people and societies to try and go back to normal, to try and reassert some kind of normalcy. That after this big shock, so many people are gonna, in some ways, want to forget that it's happened and ignore some of the lessons and some of the radical ideas it might be pointing to. That's sort of a cynical part of me, but yeah, I think this moment shows up some of the contradictions that are inherent in some of our systems. So kind of between individualism and collective thinking, for instance. So the virus is making us physically separate and maybe more individual in that way, but also underlines our need to work collectively and support each other and the most vulnerable among us. People have been maybe talking about coronavirus as the great leveler, that it affects all of us equally, and that this is some kind of lesson for us. But I think it's clear that that's not the case, and that just like many other things, it hits the poorest and the most vulnerable the hardest. Yeah, and I think the current crisis shows how vulnerable many societies are, how the resilience we lack to deal with these kinds of shocks. Because societies and economies have been focused on efficiency rather than supporting each other and that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And what between us do we see as the biggest risks and the biggest opportunities? obviously, those of us who are interested in issues to do with, the relationship between the economy and nature and the planet, but also people working on social issues, are very much thinking about COVID-19 from that perspective. But there'll be other people out there, disaster capitalists and all kinds of others, who are thinking about how they can take the opportunity of COVID-19 for different objectives. Molly, what do you see in terms of the big issues we need to be thinking about in the next few weeks and months?
Well, I think the first thing we need to say is that the vast majority of people don't want to go back to normal. And I think we need to make use of that. So we had a survey in Britain, and 91% of people said they don't want to go back to normal. They appreciated the clean air. They appreciated having streets where they could walk without cars. They appreciated seeing nature returning, even in urban settings, and they wanted to hang on to those things. So I think that's, really in our favour, that the vast majority of people have noticed those improvements and want to hold on to them. But I do think there are risks from, the dark forces that are all around us. And I would say particularly there's a risk of scapegoating. I mean, we already see with Trump calling this the Chinese virus, saying he won't allow immigration into the country, although obviously most of the vast number of cases in the US much more prevalent there than most of the countries that people would be migrating from. It's just an opportunity to carry on with racist scapegoating. And there's also a way in which the whole process of globalization is going to be challenged. And I think some aspects of that could be good, because we will build more resilient local economies, especially for food. And I think, we won't any longer say it doesn't matter who owns a company or where something's made. We see very clearly it does matter that we're not making protective gowns in the UK. So some elements of that might be positive, but some elements might just be negative, destructive trade war, and failure to cooperate internationally over trade. So, I think there are those risks, but to me, the things I hang on to are that there's really important learning coming through this experience that people will not go back on. I mean, I'm not pessimistic about that. It does depend how long this goes on, but we're going to be in some sort of strange situation for at least a year. And what we're learning at that time is the people you really depend on are your neighbours. Community really matters. Governments are incredibly powerful and can act very swiftly. Governments have access to vast amounts of money. All these things they told us about why we couldn't deal with climate change, because we're sort of selfish individualists and our government's powerless and has to cut spending. That's all been shown to be nonsense within a month. So, that's the sort of thing we have to grab hold of and say yes. And the real challenge is climate change, social justice, and now, as we come through the worst of this, let's focus on sorting those problems out with the same level of determination that we've used during this coronavirus crisis.
Anything you would add to that, George?
No, I think that's a really good summary. I think, the opportunities really come from, as Molly says, showing the scale of what can be done when there's a will, and what's required to deal with such a crisis, the scale of action that's needed, and that it can be done. I also, one of the things I'd like to see coming out of this is more of an emphasis on local and communal economies and responses to problems like climate change. I mean, obviously we can't do everything at a local level, but moving to that more kind of relational economy rather than a transactional one in a very broad sense is something that I think could come out of this. Yeah.
And I mean, there are politicians across Europe at the moment who are dealing with genuine questions about which parts of their economy to support at these times. And of course, we've got high carbon parts of the economy, be they oil and gas, arms, weapons manufacture, aviation. I mean, are these things which there needs to be a level of government protection for, do you think, George? Or, should some of these things just be excluded from that kind of government support?
Yeah, I mean, in my view, I don't think airlines and oil producers should be receiving support from governments at this time. Obviously, there's a line to be drawn here between supporting the employees of those businesses and making sure there's a just transition for them, while not propping up the shareholders and the businesses, the polluting businesses causing the climate crisis, driving the climate crisis. And I think it would be incredibly irresponsible to allow Corona to overshadow that.
Molly, what do you think the right balance is on that question?
Well, again, I think we have the chance here to really change the way the economy works. So the ecological economist Herman Daly said the problem with transferring what we've got into a sustainable economy is that it's like converting an aeroplane into a helicopter while it's in flight. But the point is our economies aren't in flight. So, you know, many of the problems that we would have faced in converting our economy to make it sustainable, we will not face at the moment. And so that's partly because companies will only survive if they get public money. That's the case now with many companies, but it's also the fact that companies are actually not manufacturing at the moment, so they could be using this. And if I was the Chancellor, I would be saying, I will not give money to unsustainable industries. I will only give money to any industries on the basis that they provide a conversion plan, which includes radical carbon reductions. And some industries we have to accept will not continue. And then I agree with George that we need to provide training and, you know, support for a just transition. So we're not careless about people's jobs, but we're very determined that as we build back better, we don't allow the dirty industries of the past just to carry on as they did before, and in some cases not to carry on at all. And also we can think about that in terms of the social justice shown by those companies. So there's a very good policy in Denmark, you may have seen, announced earlier this week, that no companies registered in tax havens will get any bailouts at all from government. And obviously we're pushing very hard that that's the case in the UK as well, because like if companies have been selfish and if their bosses have just kind of taken the money and bought themselves a Caribbean island, then they can't expect to come for a handout when times get rough. So I think there's a really big opportunity here to say we the people are putting the money into the economy to sustain it, and we get to choose the values and the kind of principles that govern the economy of the future. And that's what we need politicians to be doing now, not just saying, oh, we better give you that money, otherwise you'll go bust, and just restoring normal. No, we need to build back better. And that's why I think it's a good slogan for us all to use, a nice hashtag as well.
And the universal basic income I've seen be mentioned and revived, was previously a sort of ridiculed policy in some circles. Just with your kind of expertise around economics, I mean, what's your view on that? Is it something we should all be working for, or is it more complicated than that?
No, I think it's an excellent policy. It's always been Green Party policy, and I've always supported it. And I think what it does, it gives you a basic safety net to say, you know, you shouldn't have to worry if you can't find employment or if you choose to train for some period of your life. And to me, that's always been a good idea. But I think what we're seeing now is huge insecurity in the labour market. But we've had insecurity in the labour market building for years. But, you know, coronavirus has been the last sort of straw for some people. Even quite a lot of right-wing politicians are saying, yeah, that's clearly what we need. It helps to allow people to have security, even if they might not have a continuous job or a full-time job. But also we need to think about the more flexible ways of working that we're all using at the moment. Like, you know, I've tried for years to attend conferences by Zoom and by teleconference, and everybody's like, no, we can't possibly do that. Well, here we are doing it. The House of Commons is working that way. You know, the European Parliament's working that way. We could always have done that. And similarly, so we've got working from home, avoiding commuting, avoiding long distance travel. We've also got 4-day week, which is a Green proposal. You know, people will be spending time relaxing with their families, and they may not want to go back to sort of 9 to 5 or even 8 to sort of 10 or whatever people are working. So I think this is what we'll experience. We'll experience a different kind of life, and we need to hold on to the bits of it that are good and argue for the bits of it, like citizens' income, that would really improve everybody's lives in the long term.
George, what do you think, if you could sort of encourage European governments to be thinking about one change right now, what would it be?
That's a difficult question. I'm not sure I've got a ready answer for that one.
I remember George Monbiot's on this clip, which is circulated quite a lot on social media, and he refers to you know, the impact we could have just if by changing our habits about eating meat and by not flying. I mean, do you think that those are the two things to focus on, or something else?
From a governmental perspective, I mean, I don't think meat is really such a big issue from a governmental perspective, but maybe, yeah, some kind of frequent flyers tax or similar for airlines would be good in that sense. I'm not sure it would be the number one thing I would propose. I mean, the level of subsidy support that's already provided to polluting companies, to fossil fuel companies, to airlines across many governments in Europe is really staggering, and just removing that before we even talk about corona support would be a big improvement, I think.
I heard the other day that there are 1 million British citizens stranded overseas. I find that just extraordinary, and Brits are the worst for flying. 1 in 12 passengers on an international flight is British, which, if you think of the size of our population, is an extraordinary statistic. So even with this coming, 1 million people from Britain, flew and were elsewhere in the world out of 60 million people. I find that, it does give you a sense of the scale of aviation. And, if that's fallen off by 90% during this crisis, then I think it should stay at the 10%. It shouldn't go back to where it was by any means. 90% reductions is about what we needed.
And that statistic is an indicator as well about global inequality. I mean, and that makes me think about the debt question, the global debt relations. I mean, how do you see sort of opportunities to perhaps improve kind of public understanding of debt and some of the systems around that internationally?
Well, I think there are huge global dimensions to what's going on now. One of the most interesting things is that some of the poorer countries have dealt with this much better than some of the richer countries. So Vietnam is a good example where they realized they didn't have, the huge number of ICU beds or the tech that we have. So they were very careful to trace cases and to track contacts, and they actually had no deaths at all. So I think, we should celebrate the thing that poorer countries actually do often a lot better than we do in the sort of wealthier parts of the world, which is extremely good governance actually, and good public health. And we're watching India, but maybe that also seems to be going well. But 2 big problems are going to face the poorer countries of the world. The first one will be food, because the global food supply chains and the agricultural systems are really under stress at the moment, and that means the price of food is likely to rise. And what we mustn't allow is food speculation on price volatility like we saw in 2012 when a lot of people starved just because rich people were gambling on the price of food. I think we need interventions in the global food market to actually manage that and to take market forces out of it, especially for some key staple crops. Otherwise we're going to see hunger and starvation, and that would be so unjust if we return to that. But coming to your question of debt, the other side of this will be all countries will get into debt for the money they're spending to save their citizens' lives. And what would be really crazy would be if we allowed those debts to then lead to austerity and a global recession, or it would be on the level of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And again, the poorest countries would lose most. So we've seen some tentative steps towards debt cancellation for the poorest countries in the world. But we really need to see an international conference where we re-establish the principles on which global finance works, and that should be debt relief for the poorest countries, but also debt relief for some of the richer countries, and a new system of global finance, so we don't endlessly get into debt with each other, because that debt-based system hits the poorer countries worst, and it's completely unfair because effectively it enables the rich countries to live off the wealth of the poor without ever paying for it. And so, there's a chance here, I think, to go back to what we did at Bretton Woods, improve upon that, but really regulate the global financial system. We've needed to do that since the financial crisis, and we missed that opportunity. But this time we mustn't let that slip by. We have to make sure that the big players in the global system do come together to re-establish fair rules for global finance.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us today to be part of this conversation. For anyone who wants to find out more about any of the issues that we've talked about in this video, we're going to put a series of links below. Thank you very much.